Welcome to Ouch. Was that a ghost? This podcast may contain graphic material, which some listeners may find disturbing. Listener discretion is advised.
Help me.
Now that we covered that, here's your host, Liz.
Welcome back to Ouch Without a Ghost. I hope everyone is having a happy new year. Today I'm covering a request. There are a lot of conspiracies out there, like the moon landing was fake, Britney Spears is a clone, or the world is run by lizard people. Today we're talking about one of the more well-known conspiracies, or at least one that should be one of the more well-known conspiracies, Mkultra. This one is set apart because it was proven to be true. Although we'll never know the full extent of the program, we do know that the CIA ran a top-secret program with a wide array of human experiments, including administering high doses of LSD, electroshock therapy, sensory deprivation, just to name a few. They did all this with the goal of the government mastering mind control, a feat which they believed other countries had already accomplished. It's said to have run from 1953 to 1965, but really to around 1973, so around 20 or 25 years. But we'll never know the exact anything. It ran in hospitals, prisons, universities, just to name a few sites, throughout the US and into Canada. They would use sensory deprivation, electroshock, hallucinogenic drugs, many times without the consent of the subject. Some of the subjects were children, and this testing led to a lot of psychological damages to many of the participants. So this all started back in the 50s, the peak of the Cold War. It was a time of paranoia, heightened tension. The US thought that the Soviet Union, China, and North Korea had found a way to brainwash their prisoners. So the US government was like, hey, we want that. So Mkultra was approved in 1953 by the CIA director. These were all government-sanctioned acts to try and develop mind control or use it for interrogation responses. They focused on chemical or psychological control to ideally create something that could have a person commit an act and then have no memory of it, or carry out tasks without conscious awareness. So you're making like a super soldier. But the government couldn't say, hey, we want brainwashing. So they'd set up a front company called the Society for the Investigation of Human Ecology, which was like a front company. There, the CIA would try different ways to hypnotize or render hypnosis easier with the help of drugs or something that could erase memories or induce amnesia. The CIA heard of this new drug that was made by chemist Albert Hofmann. Hofmann discovered this drug while he was working at a lab in Switzerland. He was trying to find a respiratory or circulatory stimulant that had no effect on the uterus, like the chloramine that they were currently using for this did. So he started working on it, and then he kind of put his work away for about 5 years. And in 1943, he went back to it. He picked up his work, and he accidentally ingested some of this drug through his fingertips. He later described it as, quote, everything I saw was distorted as in a warped mirror. After he went home, he said that he saw, quote, fantastic pictures in extraordinary shapes with intense, kaleidoscopic plays of colors. The drug that he discovered being LSD. So he was basically tripping. The next day, he went and dosed himself again. This time he upped it to 250 micrograms, which I guess is about 10 times the amount of a normal dose. Panic set in. He couldn't speak for a time. He even had a doctor called in to check him out. The doctor found that he was fine, except his pupils were dilated. All of his vitals were normal. And then the euphoria and all that hit him again, thinking he found like this wonder drug. He did animal trials, then it was patented, with the intent for being used on psychiatric patients or for studies into possibly a way to treat psychiatric patients. Word of this drug, LSD, spread within the scientific community. and made its way to the CIA. And when they heard of this new drug, LSD, they were like, hey, let's try that. So the CIA was like, we'll take it all. They agreed on a price of $240,000. This was the early 1950s. It would be equivalent to over $4 million today. The CIA purchased 10 kilograms, enough for 100 million doses, trying to find a mind control drug. This wasn't the first time mind control drugs were tested or sought after. In 1916, scopamine was endorsed by an obstetrician who boasted that when he gave this drug to women during childbirth, they could still answer truthful responses. The U.S. Office of Strategic Services had already been experimenting with mescaline, scopamine, and marijuana during World War II, still trying to find that truth serum. They found that all of these did make you more talkative, but not necessarily more truthful. Even in the 40s, the Nazi scientists tested drugs like morphine, barbiturates, hallucinogens on prisoners of war with the goal of creating a truth serum. And post-Operation Paperclip, which was that secret U.S. government intelligence program where over 1,600 scientists and engineers were taken from Germany after World War II, there the U.S. gained some of their knowledge. This is theorized to be what started possibly the idea of MKUltra, although I couldn't find any definitive proof that that's it. The CIA had already started testing on human subjects with Project Bluebird, which focused on interrogation methods. It was later renamed Project Artichoke, and that would eventually be changed into MKUltra, with the goal of creating the truth serum to use on Soviet spies and to be able to create super soldiers, mind control. MKUltra was the umbrella term for the project. Under that umbrella, they had many sub-projects, around 150 of them. Some of them would be focusing purely on drug testing, like psychoactive drugs like LSD, barbiturates, marijuana. They were seeking out different drugs or techniques that could enhance suggestibility, alter memory, or induce confessions. One of their sub-projects was when they would go to prisons and they would offer prisoners their drug of choice. So if they were addicted to heroin, they would say, hey, do you want to be part of this study? Here's some heroin. But they weren't told the full extent of the study, like if the CA wanted to add LSD or whatever. Other projects being harassment techniques, where they would use sexual blackmail or surveillance, getting people into compromising situations and then recording it, like in Operation Midnight Climax. According to a later report, MKUltra was a way to test effects of LSD to voluntary willing participants, in some cases under the guidance of a doctor. So they wondered if people were given LSD without their knowledge, what would happen then? Then the head of the Federal Bureau of Narcotics signed off on it, and the program, organized by Sidney Gaultier, was underway. They wanted to see if sex with drugs would cause secrets to be spilled easier. This was a government-funded and run project, remember? So the government purchased these apartments, which they called safe houses, like in San Francisco, in New York. There they would hire sex workers. In San Francisco, the sex workers would be paid $100 for each test subject, or John, that they brought back to the safe house. The sex workers would offer the men a drink, the drink being laced with LSD. The women were trained how to lace the drinks. And the houses, unbeknownst to the men, were equipped with one-way mirrors for the CIA agents to watch. And they did, like in the secret viewing room. Ew. The men running the show would partake in the women's services and some of the supply lying around. The program was later shut down after an audit showed how this program was just dosing people without their knowledge, and some of the men that were dosed there would get sick, sometimes for hours or sometimes for days, and needed to be hospitalized. And the only thing they found out here was that men spoke after sex with or without LSD. And there was a subsection that focused on the radiological effects. Scientists were given the green light to test radiological effects to try and obtain this mind control. Some projects included ionizing radiation on the human mind to see if cognition could be affected. There were programs which focused on hypnosis and interrogation to see if a person could be hypnotized so deeply that they would reveal sensitive information or carry out tasks without knowing it. There was behavioral modification. They tried using drugs, hypnosis, and sensory deprivation to create a super soldier that would blindly carry out missions. They had sections that tested electroconvulsive therapy, or ECT. It would be used to try to erase memories and implant new ones, so inducing amnesia and then replacing the memories with new ones. Psychic driving, or depatterning, was also attempted to get a patient to regress to a childlike state and lose memories, trying to break them down and then reprogram them. Dr. Donald Cameron, a psychiatrist, was recruited to work for the CIA in the late 50s. He lived in New York and he would commute to Montreal every week to the Allen Memorial Institute of McGill University. There he would carry out experiments under a subsection of the Mkultra program. There, Dr. Cameron would dose patients or victims with LSD or other drugs, paralytics. He would use electroconvulsive therapy on them 30 to 40 times more than the normal power. Many of these patients came to the Institute for help with common mental health issues like anxiety, postpartum, depression, and he would put patients in drug-induced comas, waking them only for bathroom and meal breaks. These comas would last for weeks or sometimes up to 3 months. They were placed in what he called sleep rooms, the goal being to break them down to a childlike state. And many of these patients left way worse off than they came in, some suffering incontinence, amnesia, forgetting how to do simple tasks like how to walk, talk, read, or dress themselves. And once he found they were broken down enough, then he could continue on to psychic driving. There he would play tapes on a loop continuously over and over again. These could be phrases, sounds, or voices. And patients didn't have a choice whether to listen or not. Speakers would be placed throughout the room or in helmets that were then placed on the patient. Some of them fought listening to it, so he realized it was easier to just put them back into a drug-induced coma and continue to play it on repeat. He tested on humans to see if he could erase memories and implant new ones, like they were guinea pigs, destroying many lives. Like Esther Scryer, who was a nurse, and she lost her 3-year-old child due to a staph infection. She was pregnant with a second child, and she sought out Dr. Cameron's care to help with depression and anxiety and postpartum. When in his care, he placed her into a sleeping room, where the pregnant Esther stayed for a month. She lost over 10 pounds. In his notes, Dr. Cameron wrote, quote, "She is disoriented as to the time and only is probably in her second stage of depatterning. There's no incontinence, there's no mutism, and we are continuing this intense treatment of her until we get the complete depatterning." 2 days later, she was considered depatterned. She was not able to stand, talk, could barely swallow, was incontinent, and needed to be seen by an obstetrician for her heavy bleeding. Once she gave birth, Cameron stopped her treatment. Her child did survive, thankfully, but Esther struggled to even care for her child anymore. She struggled doing simple tasks. She never did fully recover from what Dr. Cameron put her through. There's also the heartbreaking case of Velma Orlikow, who said she went to the Allen Memorial Institute to deal with possible depression. There she met Dr. Cameron. She became an unwilling and unknowing participant in his research. He forced her into an isolation cell and forced her to listen to recordings over and over for hours on end after giving her LSD and other drugs. She left there as well, a complete different person, having trouble reading or writing, never being the same. Jean Charles Page met Dr. Cameron at a clinic in 1959. He was dealing with depression and alcoholism. Once there, Dr. Cameron put him into a drug-induced sleep coma for 36 days. In 30 days of psychic driving, where the recordings would be played over and over, he said, quote, "It was like a bad horror movie. I would wake up and there would be 5 doctors at the end of my bed chanting, 'Kill him, kill him.' He said they were trying to frighten me to test my reaction." While there is more known about Dr. Cameron's experiments than most of MKUltra, there's still not tons. There's tons of files missing. There were sections where mind control assassins were attempted to be created, where drugs and psychological methods were used attempting to control people to carry out operations. It wasn't just adults. Children were also laced with different drugs and were forced to go through all torturous research. Although some people consented to be a part of the studies, There's a whole ethical part, the lack of informed consent. Some were not given all the information, and some completely unaware that they were even being dosed or part of a study. Then there is the story of Frank Olson. Frank Olson served as a captain in the U.S. Army Chemical Corps, a branch that dealt with chemical, biological, radiological, and nuclear weapons. After Frank left the Army, he would go on to work in different top secret organizations, including taking part in Operation Paperclip with the ex Nazis. Even after being discharged, he continued to work as a contracted civilian scientist. He took part in Operation Harness in Antigua, testing toxic clouds on animals, Operation Sea Spray, which released bacteria in coastal mist, reaching all of San Francisco's 800,000 residents, as well as people in surrounding cities. He spent time at Fort Terry on Plum Island, which is off of Long Island. You can only get there by plane or boat because the base is secluded because they test toxins there that are too dangerous to be on mainland. His specialty was aerosolizing poisons or biological warfare. He worked making a lot of James Bond type stuff, like lipstick that would kill you, or lighters filled with deadly gas, or shaving cans filled with whatever. While he was still a contracted civilian scientist, he was recruited to work with the CIA. There he worked on what was originally called Project Bluebird, which I mentioned earlier. It originated because a cardinal confessed to things that people thought that he could not possibly have done. They thought it was a mind control situation and wanted to know how to do it and have it themselves. This program would go on to be Project Artichoke and then MKUltra. In 1953, Frank Olson received an invitation to attend a pre-Thanksgiving CIA gathering. These were semi-monthly retreats. It was pretty normal. They had them pretty frequently. It was held at Deep Creek Lake from Wednesday, November 18th to Friday, November 20th, 1953. There were about 12 there, scientists and others closely involved in the Project MKUltra. Wednesday, the first night went, pretty normal. Thursday, the next night, after dinner, the men were all given a drink of liquor. Then a bit later, they were told that they had all been dosed with, quote, a potential truth serum. It was LSD. Frank Olson seemingly having an adverse reaction to it. He ended up going back home after the retreat, but he seemed different. He wouldn't eat. He was distant. At a point, he confided in his wife that, quote, I've made a terrible mistake. When Frank Olson went back to work at Fort Detrick, he tried to resign, but a lieutenant colonel was able to talk him down a bit, saying, why don't you go and seek out some psychiatric treatment, see if you still feel the same way after. So he agreed, and they had a plan to go to New York, where Frank would go and see a doctor and be admitted to a hospital for a bit and see if he could figure stuff out. So, accompanied by two other coworkers, Frank Olson went out to New York. He arrived on November 27th, 1953, where he and Robert Lashbrook were going to stay at the Slater Hotel. I've seen on the 10th floor or the 13th floor. I'm not sure which one. Either way, that night, the next morning at 2 a.m., Frank Olson fell, from his 10th floor window to the sidewalk in front of the hotel. The night manager heard this and he ran outside to find the cause of the commotion, what just happened. There he found Frank Olson on his back in his underwear, still alive, who was trying to mumble something to him. Frank ended up dying shortly after, before EMS even arrived. The night manager did find the whole thing a bit off, as he would later say, quote, in all my years in the hotel business, I've never encountered a case where someone got up in the middle of the night, ran across a dark room in his underwear, avoiding two beds, and dove through a closed window with the shade and curtains drawn. Police quickly found which room that Frank was staying in, and they went up to the room. There they found Robert Lashbrook. The switchboard operator from the hotel reported connecting a call from the room, and back then, switchboard operators would connect the calls, but they could also listen in on the calls, which she did. She reported that a male from Frank Olson and Robert Lashbrook's room made a phone call. The male from the room said, quote, well, he's gone, to which the other male, who was the recipient of the phone call, said, well, that's too bad. The recipient would later be determined to have been Dr. Harold Abramson. Dr. Harold Abramson worked for the CIA, and Frank had been seeing him as a psychiatrist, but Dr. Abram was an allergist. I don't know. The family was notified of how Frank Olson had fallen or jumped from his 10th or 13th floor room. The police report said that Frank Olson threw himself out of the window. At the funeral, they had a closed casket, as they said the body was in too bad of a condition. The family didn't know really what happened, but they just had to accept the story that they heard. And that was kind of the end of it. And that was kind of the end of it until in 1974, a New York Times journalist named Seymour Hersh published a story alleging that the CIA had performed non consensual drug experiments and illegal spying on U.S. citizens. This prompted an investigation by the U.S. Congress and resulted in the Church Committee being formed, which was a U.S. Senate Select Committee with the job to study governmental operations with respect to intelligence activities. This was chaired by Senator Frank Church, hence the name Church Committee. The committee was one of a series of investigations into abuse within the intelligence agencies that year, including its House counterpart, the Pike Committee, and the Presidential Rockefeller Commission. A lot was revealed by this committee. COINTELPRO, which was the surveillance and infiltration of political and civil rights organizations, Family Jewels, a CIA program to assassinate foreign leaders, Operation Mockingbird, a propaganda campaign, and Mkultra. Sorry, quick side note. The CIA's experiments weren't just with humans, they also had animal experiments. There was one program called Operation Acoustic Kitty. The CIA believed that cats could be trained. They obviously never had a cat. They had the idea to train the cat and surgically implant a microphone and an antenna with batteries for power. This was said to have cost about $20 million. So they had their cat all filled with these devices and then sent the cat on its first mission. And then the cat just did what it wanted to because it's a cat. And sadly, the cat was hit by a taxi and killed. And I guess that was the end of it, but there is still a report out there from the CIA stating that cats can be trained, which I don't know why I find that kind of funny. Sorry. But the Church Committee report read that MKUltra, quote, drugs were used primarily as an aid to interrogations, but MKUltra materials were also used for harassment, discrediting, or disabling purposes. They found that 86 universities or institutions were involved, as well as 185 non-governmental researchers and assistants, on top of all the physicians, toxicologists, specialists in narcotics that were involved in the studies. But remember, this CIA program would use like front companies to hire and pay, so some were unaware, but some I'm guessing were aware. I don't know. This program tested people on all social levels, many unknowing participants. Even the Army had test subjects, some volunteers, some were dosed without their knowledge. The Church Committee did criticize the program for its lack of ethics and oversight, and a report was released to the public. In there, it told of a civilian scientist who worked for the Navy. He was dosed with LSD without his consent or knowledge. He had adverse effects from the LSD, and he was sent to New York for mental health care, and he ended up jumping from the 10th floor of his hotel room. This was published in New York Times and the New York Post. Frank Olson's family read about this and realized that this sounded very familiar. They contacted the government, who confirmed that this was about Frank Olson. The family was invited to the White House, where they got a formal apology from then President Gerald Ford. They received an apology from the CIA director, William Colby, and they were offered a wrongful death settlement in the amount of $750,000, which the family took. After Frank's wife passed in 1994, Frank's son had their father's body exhumed to be buried with their mother. And while he was exhumed, they also had a second autopsy performed by Dr. James Stars. The second autopsy showed that Frank Olson's body did not have cuts on it, as it said in the first autopsy. And this wasn't really consistent with going through a glass window. It was also found in this autopsy that Frank had blunt force trauma on his head and a chest injury. Now, Frank Olson was found on his back on the street. The autopsy found that the injuries inflicted most likely happened prior to the fall, and he found it, quote, suggestive of homicide. Eric Olson, Frank Olson's son, testified in front of the U.S. House of Representatives at the hearing on the U.S. government's Cold War-era human subject experiments. There, he talked about the mysterious circumstances surrounding his father's death, the lack of transparency with the CIA, and he even tried to sue the CIA, but he already signed that settlement years ago with his mother, so he decided he'd just go to the media. Conspiracies ran wild that the CIA just got rid of Frank Olson because he'd seen too much between MKUltra program and Frank going to what the CIA called black sites. They were secret CIA detention centers where people suspected of being enemy agents or expendables would be tortured, many times to death. And Frank, before his death, had been really stressed out. And people that work in top secret operations and then their conscience kicks in could be seen in some cases as a liability. It's also funny that in 1953, the year that Frank died, the CIA had a handbook. It was called The Study of Assassination. In this handbook, it covers the best way to assassinate someone. It describes how dropping someone 75 feet or more will result in the death being minimally investigated. And in 1954, a document was executed by the Department of Justice granting immunity to members of the CIA for any crimes, which would include murder. Frank Olson is just one death directly associated with the program, but who knows if there are more people that died because of this. After all this information became public, President Ford issued an executive order on intelligence activities. There were some legal and policy changes like informed consent and regulations involving human subjects prohibiting, quote, experimentation with drugs on a human subject, except with the informed consent in writing and witnessed by a disinterested party of each human subject. I have seen that other prolific people may have been test subjects, like James Whitey Bulger from the Winter Hill Gang. If you're a Massachusetts person, you know who he is, but maybe everybody knows who he is. He claims to have been given weekly injections of LSD while incarcerated in Atlanta in 1957. Ted Kaczynski, the Unabomber, may have been part of the study. Sirhan's attorney claims that he was acting under the mind control of MKUltra when he assassinated Robert F. Kennedy. Author Tom O'Neill claims that Charles Manson was part of the drug testing of MKUltra. I've also read that the person that wrote One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest may have been a test subject as well. But because the CIA director ordered records to be destroyed in 1973, this was the time of the Watergate scandal, many of the around 150 sub-research projects will never be made public. The only reason we know what we do is because 20,000 documents survived due to a filing error that were filed with financial records. And when somebody requested a Freedom of Information Act and got their files, those documents were in there. There were multiple lawsuits filed, but many were not compensated at all. And even the ones that did get compensated, like really, what does that do? Many individuals reported anxiety, hallucinations, other long-term effects because of MKUltra testing. The whole story seems to have been buried because of the whole Nixon scandal. As a whole, the program seems to have accomplished nothing that we know of besides ruining multiple people's lives and introducing LSD to the world during, flaming the hippies movement. None of the scientists involved in MKUltra were ever brought to justice, but the CIA did say it won't happen again. And in an article I just read, in 2018, there was newly released project information of MKUltra, which revealed how the CIA was testing out remote-controlled dogs. They took these dogs and implanted electrodes into their brains and surgically implanted battery packs and stimulators where electrodes could be sent, and these dogs could be made to turn, run, and stop. I don't know if they ever actually did this out in the field, but that's so sick. But who knows what the government is still up to? Look at the alien stuff that just came out and then the drone stuff. I don't know. I never really was a tinfoil hat person, but maybe I'm becoming one now. Who knows? This is just very slightly touching on the information that's out there. You can go and read the whole church committee hearing. It's 173 pages, and they go into more details. And there's a lot of people out there on the internet that claim their parents were victims of Dr. Cameron or the grandparents. Well, thank you everybody so much for listening. Happy 2025. Till next time. Bye.
Thank you for listening. If you need more content or just want to help support the podcast, head on over to patreon.com and search Ouch Was that a ghost? If you need some snazzy merch, you can find it at crowdmade.com by searching Ouch, Was That a Ghost? If you have a story you'd like to share, you can email it to ouchwasthataghost@yahoo.com. You can also find us on Facebook and all the other social media platforms under Ouch, Was That a Ghost?
Help me.
All links can also be found on ouchwasthataghost.com.